Kody, thank you for being here. So I just want to start out by introducing you to Kody so you get to know him a little bit more. He's schizophrenic hippie on social media with over 1.5 million followers. He's the most followed schizophrenia advocate and one of the top content creators in the space and beyond.
Yeah, thank you guys so much for having me. So as Marissa said, my name's Kody. I am a schizophrenia content creator, motivational speaker, and I've been using my social media for the past 3 to 4 years to talk about schizophrenia, addiction recovery, and my life after incarceration. So my introduction to schizophrenia wasn't with my own diagnosis. I was actually raised by a mother with schizoaffective disorder. So well before I ever showed symptoms of schizophrenia, I actually took on the role as a caregiver for someone with schizoaffective disorder. And so schizophrenia has been a large part of my life, both as someone living with it, but as someone with a loved one struggling with schizophrenia. And it's really impacted how I educate people about it, what kind of content I create, and how I decide to cope with it as well. So I appreciate you guys having me, and I'm excited to get more into the podcast, tell you guys more about my story. I would love if you guys have any questions at the end to be able to answer some of those as well.
So I'm going to back up a little bit because I know you present day in the last couple of years, and just hearing about some of the things that you've been through in the past is just unbelievable sometimes because of what I see in front of me today. And I'm sure a lot of us just sitting here right now probably think that too. So take us through before diagnosis. What was it like before and leading up to that? And then we'll go from there.
Yeah, so as I had mentioned, my mom has schizoaffective disorder. So when I was very young, my mom started having auditory and visual hallucinations, as well as paranoia and delusions. She was a single mom, so at the time, we lived in rural Wisconsin. We didn't really know who to go to. We didn't have a lot of answers. She spent many years with the wrong diagnosis. She wasn't able to get access to medication or treatment right away. And so because of not getting early intervention, it had very bad cognitive effects. And so she still struggles today with, the lack of treatment she got early on. And it was when I went off to college, after my mom got stable, she finally did get her diagnosis, she did get medication. I went off to college. I was no longer taking on the role as a caregiver. And right around 18, 19 years old, my first year in college is when I went through my own psychotic break. And so while in college and working full time, I started having auditory and visual hallucinations, as well as delusions and paranoia. And it caused me to have to drop out of school, and I lost my job. And I ended up falling into addiction as a way to try to cope and self-medicate. And it made it really difficult because I was barely functioning. I was going through all these symptoms. Even though I had seen what schizophrenia looks like through my mom's diagnosis, because of the delusion that surrounds the illness, I wasn't able to have the critical thinking skills or the ability to understand that that's what was going on with me at the time. And so for several years, I struggled with addiction and not being diagnosed, which eventually led to me being incarcerated. And so a large part of my story and my social media is not just around schizophrenia and advocacy, but it's about also addiction and incarceration and how all three of the topics are combined.
So even though, you grew up with your mom having schizoaffective disorder and seeing what she had been through, you didn't immediately recognize those symptoms in yourself or knowing that something, might be up with you, that just something seemed off. So could you talk a little bit more about that and then up to when you were ready to, seek a diagnosis and see what might be going on?
Yeah, so when I was first experiencing symptoms, because of my delusion, I didn't think there was anything wrong with me. And so for many years, I thought that I was gaining some sort of ability. I actually had conscious thoughts I can remember having where I believed that the voices I was hearing were the thoughts of other people, and I was gaining some sort of abilities. And because of that level of delusion, I couldn't critically think, and I couldn't make the connection between my mom's diagnosis, even after years of being her caregiver and knowing what schizophrenia was, and probably more than most of the general public, because I had a direct connection to the illness. I still couldn't process that that's what was going on with me. It wasn't until I was in jail that I started realizing that something might be wrong with me. And it wasn't that I believed I had schizophrenia. I just started figuring out that I couldn't function like everyone else. Everyone was able to do things every single day so easily, and I couldn't do what everyone else was doing. And so I tried to start reaching out for help while I was incarcerated. Unfortunately, the American prison and jail system isn't really set up for people to get help with severe mental illness or psychiatric disorders. So I wasn't able to get the help I needed while I was incarcerated. It wasn't until I was released that I was able to reach out to my friends, my family that had been trying to support me this entire time through my addiction. And no matter how much I was pushing them away, they really were trying so hard to get me help and get me resources. And so when I did reach out, they had all of these resources prepared and ready to go. So they had a doctor I could go to, a psychiatrist for me to be referred to. They helped me find local peer support groups. And I know that's going to be something we talk about later, but that was instrumental for me being able to recognize I wasn't alone and that there was other people also struggling with this illness. And so it was around that time that because of my mom's diagnosis, my diagnosis and treatment came much quicker. There is a genetic component to schizophrenia, and so because of that, once I showed those symptoms and I reached out for help, they were able to figure out pretty quick that that's probably what I was struggling with. And so I got my formal diagnosis of undifferentiated schizophrenia. It was before they diagnosed it as schizophrenia spectrum disorder. And so that was one of the subtypes at the time. And I got that diagnosis. I immediately was able to get on antipsychotic medication. And that was just the beginning of my medication and treatment journey. And I know we're going to dive into that a little more, but
yeah. Awesome. And I want to make sure that we cover the basics too before we get too far into it. But can you give us your definition of schizophrenia and what's that like?
I always explain schizophrenia to people as a mental health disorder that prevents critical thinking skills and causes hallucinations, delusions, paranoia. And because those are the recognized major symptoms, I'm also trying to be better at educating people about the negative and cognitive symptoms that come with schizophrenia as well. That will be more of the issues with memory, not being able to communicate or articulate thoughts, which is something I really struggled with early on. And that's what pushed me to do motivational speaking as a way to get my voice back and be able to help people better understand. But it was all of these symptoms that, I started experiencing and I didn't know were involved with schizophrenia. And so educating people about it, it became a huge part of my life.
Unfortunately, a lot of people with either serious mental illness or schizophrenia can end up in this situation or eventually become incarcerated. So could you talk about that and how the violence piece of it that we were talking about?
Yeah, so, and there's a lot of, misinformation and misconceptions about mental illness and schizophrenia. One that I always get on social media is people thinking that because I have schizophrenia, I am somehow more dangerous. I'm inherently dangerous. And this was something that is not new. It's been even since my mom first received her diagnosis. I remember being a kid and people weren't allowed to come to my house because my mom had a schizophrenia diagnosis and their parents didn't understand it. They were afraid of it. And so just another way that it shows that we didn't have awareness and education out there about it.
What was it like after the diagnosis? What was it like when you were seeking treatment? What options and resources did you have available to you?
Because my diagnosis and my treatment came very quickly, I found that I was having a lot of success right away with antipsychotic medication. So although I do still struggle with some symptoms today, I still have auditory and visual hallucinations occasionally, but my delusions and paranoia went away almost completely, which is what made it so possible for me to be able to function day to day and be able to regain my ability to do the things that I lost because of schizophrenia. And it's what allowed me to get stable enough to look at other treatment options as well. So a couple of years ago, like about a year ago, I transitioned to long-acting injectables, so I didn't have to worry about the stress of forgetting to take my meds. Or I travel a lot now, so forgetting to bring them with. The TSA doesn't like when you have to bring 9 pill bottles onto a plane. Apparently they get weird about that. So Uh, so it was just another thing to help me become even more stable. And all of that came because I had a very close relationship with my psychiatrist. So the psychiatrist that diagnosed me is still my psychiatrist today. And I know a lot of people don't get that lucky with their first doctor or their first psychiatrist. And I've been very fortunate that she allows me to be very involved with my treatment plan. Once I started showing stability, she gave me a lot of freedom to say, hey, like, I don't think this med is working, or I don't like the side effects of this one. I don't like how drowsy this one makes me. By the end of my experience with oral medication, I was on 3 different antipsychotics. But it got to a point where the reason we were on all of those was because it gave me the stability I wanted, gave me the clarity I wanted, and I was still able to function enough where I could do the type of work I do. And then transitioning to an LAI was something that was always on her radar, but because of my history with hospitals and stuff like that, I was always too afraid to do it. And then I found out I could do it just like at a Walgreens, and I could go in and they could administer it there. People who have a long history with a mental illness or addiction might be weary to go into a hospital, or if they've been involuntarily admitted, it's hard for them to have to go into these facilities. And so knowing there was an other option made that possible for me, and that was huge. So that I could still do this, but not have to go into a facility where I don't feel safe, or it does cause more stress and symptoms.
So in addition to treatment, talk to us more about what your circle of support looks like. You touched on your care team a little bit. I want to make sure that you mention your amazing mom, Tara, and your gorgeous wife, Allison, and what they are to you and how they help you.
My care team started as, a doctor, a psychiatrist, and what I really realized in my journey through treatment and recovery was that care teams are not only your medical team. It's the people in your everyday life. It is, the caregivers that we don't talk about enough. And so because when I did finally reach out for help, my mom and wife were there. They were the ones who essentially became a major part of my care team. They're as crucial to my care as my psychiatrist, as my doctor. And it's because of them that I was able to get the stability and help that I have today. A lot of what they did, like I said, was early on, they had the resources put in place for me to get the help I needed when I finally reached out and asked for the help. But they also have continuously helped me to keep going with my meds. They help me re-educate myself if they think that I'm struggling to have clarity, or if they can tell that a lot of people with schizophrenia, including myself, had moments where I quit medication because I felt like it wasn't working instead of going to my psychiatrist, or I quit medication because it was working really well and I think I didn't need it anymore. So it's unfortunately super common for people with schizophrenia. They were really good at being there in those moments and helping to make sure that if I was going to quit a med, it was to transition to something else, or to make sure that I communicated it with my doctor, and just that's what prevented, relapse and making it harder to function day to day.
So now I want to transition a bit so that you can talk to us more about your advocacy now. So once you became more stable over the years and realized that you wanted to tell your story and to help others, what did that look like? What inspired you to do that? Why did you do it?
So I always tell people I'm an unintentional advocate. My journey was not one I necessarily planned. I knew that I wanted to share my story, but there is such a stigma around schizophrenia and mental illness that I didn't ever think I would be doing it at the level I am now. The way it originally started was while I was incarcerated, I started going to peer support groups for AA and NA, which is Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous. And I was really only going to these for a reason to get out and do something. There's not a whole lot you can do when you're in jail. So I was trying to find ways to just not have to be in my cell, and I found these groups. And at first I was going just to get out of my cell. What I realized was there was people in there who had very similar stories to me. And I was finding connections in some of their issues with addiction and some of their issues with mental health and mental illness. And so when I got out of jail, I became fascinated with learning more about peer support. So immediately after I got my diagnosis and my treatment, I started going to peer support groups through the National Alliance for Mental Illness, which was so helpful for me. I think it's such a big part of my story because I went to, I want to say it was 5 sessions before I even told anyone what my name was. I just went, I listened, I was making connections between other people's journeys and my own. I was hearing about other people who were both caregivers and patients. And so peer support is kind of what launched my advocacy. And then the way that I became an unintentional advocate was my wife started sending me TikToks, and I was like, this app is so stupid. I'm never going to download this app. And I finally did, just to watch the videos she was sending me. And what happened was the algorithm's very good on there. I started finding content creators I really liked. So I was finding like bipolar content creators and people with mental illness and mental health issues. And I was finding comedians and like really cool content creators. So I decided I was going to start sharing my story as well. I started with a video I called Schizophrenic Storytime. It's a segment I still do today. And my very first schizophrenic story time, when I posted it, I had 300 followers. I went to sleep and I woke up the next day to 10,000 followers. I have since turned off my notifications for TikTok. So that began the journey. And now I have 1.3 million followers on TikTok. We just hit, on this trip, we hit 250,000 followers on Instagram. And I have 50,000 followers on YouTube. And it just became my full-time job educating people about schizophrenia, not only what the illness is, but how I cope with it, different techniques that I use, which I'm sure you have a question in there about it. So, so I have different techniques I've used that have gone pretty viral, especially like even in this last week. If you guys are on social media and you saw a video about a schizophrenia service dog, it currently is sitting at about 23 million views. I have a service dog named Luna. She helps me identify visual hallucinations. And so the way she does that is I ask her to greet the hallucination because I genuinely believe in that moment that I'm talking to another person. And so she's trained to either greet the person on command, or if no one is there, she sits down and looks up at me, and then I know that that person is a visual hallucination. And that's just one of the many coping mechanisms I use. I also had several videos of mine go viral because I use my phone as a way to also look at visual hallucinations. So if I think the person I'm talking to is a visual hallucination, I will open my phone, open the camera, and I'll look through the camera to see if the person's really there, because they won't show up on my phone. And so like these different coping mechanisms and using technology has helped me to cope day to day. It's helped me feel more comfortable being out in public, and it's given me the ability to differentiate between what's real and what's not.
How much did it help you to see other people with schizophrenia? And this was the early days of, I guess, advocates being online on social media, but to see that what was possible. And then, in the schizophrenic story times that you started out with, I want you to tell everyone about that. And just, when people reach out to you and tell you, Kody, thank you so much for sharing your story. I didn't think any of this, would be possible. I thought that my diagnosis would be a death sentence. What does that all feel like?
It became very clear very early on the impact I was making on social media. I get a lot of patients who reach out and they say, I noticed some of your videos, I recognized some of those symptoms in myself, and it got me to go talk to my doctor, and now I have a formal diagnosis and I have treatment and medication, which is so amazing. But I also get a lot of people who reach out and they tell me my videos help them better understand their loved one with schizophrenia or a person that they're a caregiver for. I get a lot of doctors and psychiatrists who reach out now and they tell me that they've used some of the coping mechanisms I use. They tell them to patients. And so like my phone technique, a lot of patients are being told now by psychiatrists who have found my videos online. And like stuff like that is surreal to me because there was a time where I felt so alone. And like you had said, a lot of people that get a diagnosis like schizophrenia, it feels like a death sentence, especially if all you've ever seen of schizophrenia is how it's portrayed on movies and TV shows. I was so afraid, I felt so alone. And that's how peer support came into my life, but that's also how advocacy came into my life. And I essentially became the voice that I needed when I was in that point, because when I was first diagnosed, I just wanted to see anyone living a full functional life with schizophrenia. Unfortunately, like I had talked about, my mom, the only person I had ever known with schizophrenia was my mom, and she went undiagnosed for so long that it had such cognitive effects on her ability to function day to day, and I didn't see anything better happening for me. And so to do what I do now at the level that I am able to function and be involved with advocacy and helping people learn about schizophrenia is something I never imagined.
No, it's incredible that you've made a career out of your advocacy and to see what you've done. So that's one of the things I want to talk about next is now that you don't just tell your own story, you lend your voice to help tell the stories of others. So talk to us about what the Unseen and Unheard podcast is, your experience as the host, and maybe preview a couple of the stories that people can go listen to anywhere where you find your podcasts.
So I met Marissa and some of the other J&J staff at Healthy Voices, which is an amazing conference of all health creators, not just in the mental health space, but diabetes, cancer, and so I got to meet all of these amazing creators, and we got to connect with the idea of doing the second season of the Unseen and Unheard podcast. And when J&J reached out, I was so excited because I love the idea of amplifying other patients' voices. I have such a unique platform, and I have the ability that, people all over the world know my story. They know that I'm, a schizophrenia advocate, but there are so many patients out there who are wanting to share their own stories and who are just getting started in their advocacy careers and just getting started talking about mental illness. And so the Unseen and Unheard podcast is a project that I couldn't be more happy, not with just who we asked to be on, but the results of the episodes. We had amazing conversations. I'm going to talk to you guys about 2 episodes specifically that I would recommend you check out. So the first one I would recommend is with Carlos. He is a nurse practitioner who is currently going to school to be a lawyer. He lives with schizophrenia. And he, to me, is the perfect example of your illness doesn't define you. And he always talks about goal setting. So a large part of our conversation on that episode was talking about how setting small goals in the beginning led to the ability to do what he does now. And so we talked about how early on, even in my own diagnosis, I do a to-do list, and I still do a to-do list every single day, but the first 3 items on there are wake up, get out of bed, brush teeth. And to any other person that might sound really easy, but there was a point in my life where I could barely do those 3 things. That would be my to-do list for the day. And so now to have to write, go speak to a conference or go do different advocacy events, talk to peers, it's surreal to me. And we talked a lot about that goal setting and how effective that is for people who are going through treatment and need something to look forward to and something to help them motivate themselves. And that was an amazing episode. The other episode I would recommend is with my mom. So if you're going to listen to it, have tissues nearby because I cried and I was in the episode. And not only did she talk about her diagnosis of schizoaffective disorder, she also talked about what it was like having to watch her son go through the same diagnosis. How terrifying that was, how frustrating it was, knowing what it was and not being able to get me the help because I wasn't aware that I needed the help. And it's a tough conversation, but it was so important because it reminded me that I don't advocate just for myself. I advocate for my mom, and I advocate for all the people who have voices that you're never going to hear. All of the people who are never going to get the access to treatment that I had, the ability to talk to a doctor, go to a psychiatrist, the ability to get sober enough to get the help they need. There's so many people who will never be able to share their stories, and the Unseen and Unheard podcast allowed us to do that. And you can get that anywhere you listen to podcasts. So
we love a shameless plug. We love it. So I think I want to close our conversation here, and then we'll open it up to questions. But what's advice that you would give to someone who's earlier in their journey now, or something that you wish you could, tell yourself a few years ago?
I love the conversation about goal setting, so that would definitely be one of the things I would talk about. But the main thing that I always when I have patients reach out or other people living with schizophrenia reach out, I always try to remind them that they're not alone, because I think that's why so many people struggle with serious mental illness and schizophrenia. If you're someone like me who grew up in a town of 2,000 people with a graduating class of 40 people, it was such a small area that I didn't realize these things existed, let alone were so common. When studies show that like 1 in 100 people have schizophrenia, and the only person I had ever known was my mom, or at least that's what I thought. What I'm finding out now as an advocate is there are people living day-to-day lives who are too afraid to talk about their diagnosis because of the stigma. And so that's why we don't see these success stories. That's why we don't get to see people like Carlos, people like, Michelle Hammer, people like Rachel Starr, who is also at this event. Like, there are advocates living full, functional, healthy lives with schizophrenia, and that's possible for anyone struggling. And so that would be the message I would try to get. If I could whisper in the ear of every person struggling, that's what I would say.
Awesome. Well, tell us again, Kody, where can we find you on social?
I'll say it again, but I know the question is going to come up, so I'm going to say it, but I'm also going to answer. You can find me on Facebook, TikTok, Instagram, and the username is Schizophrenic Hippie. And so the username came from my first hate comment. So one of the things that I deal with a lot as a health creator is hate comments, people that are either not educated about the illness or are too involved with the misinformation around schizophrenia. And so one of the very first hate comments I got was someone called me a schizophrenic hippie. And so I decided that was my username. And 4 years later, it has stuck. And even if I wanted to change it, my followers have told me that is not an option anymore. So
you embraced it. We love it. And then the Hope for Schizophrenia website, it's hopeforschizophrenia.com, is also another amazing resource. The more information about the podcast is there. And then there's a tab called Community Voices with other articles and stories from advocates too. Bethany Iser is another one that we wanted to mention with the Cures Foundation. So Kody, thank you so much for being here with us. Absolutely amazing conversation. And then we'll open it up for questions from everyone.
My name's Crystal, and I work in mental health as well. And you talked a lot about receiving a diagnosis and getting support through psychological interventions and drug therapies. But you also talked about addiction. And I guess if you had to choose a pathway for an individual, would you address the addiction first or the psychological experience first?
It's such a difficult topic because addiction and mental illness are so intertwined. What I realized when I was incarcerated is most of the people in jails around the U.S. are really people that should be in psychiatric facilities or recovery facilities. I think there's very few people in prison facilities that are actually meant to be there. There are so many people struggling with addiction and mental illness, and that just intuitively falls into incarceration then. And so it's like a never-ending cycle. If someone can get help for either, I think whatever works best is going to be the go-to. I think it's hard for people to get treatment for mental illness while struggling with addiction. So I believe that's what's usually addressed first. But the thing that makes it difficult is a lot of people are using because of mental illness. And so whatever a trained professional is able to address first, I'm always going to support and that goes back to, addiction recovery not being a linear thing. I think the unfortunate part is we would all love for mental health recovery and for addiction recovery to be a one-size-fits-all, and I just don't think that is what it is. And so whatever works best for the patient is what I'm going to support. So I wish there was a more concrete answer, but it's such a good question.
I missed the first part of this thing, so maybe you can cover some of this, but I guess two questions. One of them, I was at a session yesterday where they were talking about new ways to basically map the brain, the Connect Gnome. Have you had a Connect Gnome map done of your brain, and is there anything that looks targetable for treatment? And then secondly, I had a friend back when I was in getting my physics degree, and she had schizophrenia, and so we were, studying together, and all at once she just started weeping because I said, well, what's wrong? She's like, so and so just stood up and yelled at me. Mm-hmm. How do you support somebody when something like that happens? Because you can go, well, that didn't happen, but like that's probably not helpful.
Yeah. The first part of the question, early on in my diagnosis, I did do so. Because of my diagnosis, they do a lot of the brain scans and stuff like that, just to make sure that the symptoms aren't caused from a physical health issue, because there are some physical health issues that can cause hallucinations and paranoia. So I think that's one thing they always want to look for first. They want to make sure that it's not, I know there's been instances where people with tumors can experience hallucinations, and then there are also other mental illnesses and mental health issues that experience hallucinations, bipolar disorder, PTSD. So I did a lot of physical testing too, to make sure that it wasn't something that was going on with people that are in accidents can get bruises on their brain that can cause hallucinations as well. So they did some of that, but I've never done the actual mapping thing that you're talking about. I've heard of it, and I know that's trying to be able to identify earlier to get people early intervention. In the instance of specific hallucinations, I always lean on the side of if the person is, if they're medicated, they're going through treatment, they can usually communicate what works best for them. Someone early on, it's hard to know how to interact, but I know I have friends that are schizophrenia advocates that they say they really prefer that people just would tell them that the person's not there or try to reassure them. I found with me, what happens is when my wife or my mom would try to do that, it would make me paranoid about them. So what my wife and my mom started doing, and they figured this out before I figured out it's what helped me, was they literally just will try to distract me. So they won't address it. They won't say it's not there. They also won't feed into it to make me comfortable in the moment, because that just makes it harder for me to differentiate between what's real and what's not. So they've gotten very good at distracting me, getting me to talk about anything else, trying to get my attention away from what I'm dealing with and trying to get it more focused on a task or a game or anything to get it away from what I'm experiencing. But if someone's doing treatment and going through their medication journey and they're at least have a little bit of clarity, the best thing you can do is ask them in moments where they're not struggling how they would like you to react when they are struggling. It's a good question. Thank you.
Hi, Kody.
Hi.
My name is John. Thank you for sharing your story. I think it's very inspiring. I think what you shared about wanting to whisper in the ear of everyone out there was struggling and basically letting them know that they're not alone. What's your big idea of getting there? Because I think you've gotten a whole lot way down the road with 1.5 million followers, right? So maybe you can share a little bit about what that swinging for the fences idea is. And I was asking because I think maybe some of us here in this room could be in a catalytic space of wanting to kind of maybe amplify that for you. So, yeah, happy to hear it.
I think the podcast has been, a really good way of reaching more people with this message, and not only sharing my story, but sharing other advocates' stories. I think my big thing is just continuing to maintain the platforms that I've already established, because I want to make sure that 5 years from now, if TikTok's gone or if Instagram's gone, whatever the case is, I want my content to still be accessible to people. And so that means branching out to new platforms. That means reaching people in different ways, like through this podcast. I'm working on a publishing project right now. So any platform that I can get people and reach people is where I'm going to be. So as technology changes, I love this conference is the perfect place to be right now to have this conversation, because I see different things happening in VR and XR, and I want to be a part of that. And I will be, believe me. I'm one of those people, once I have an idea, I'm like, this is going to be something that we can use. And VR peer support groups and finding ways to help people better understand what schizophrenia looks like through VR. Like there's so many things that probably haven't been even worked on yet that I think will be stuff I do in the future, but it's always about trying to adapt to what's going to get my message the furthest and who I can work with to make sure that it's landing on the most ears possible. And that's been for a long time now. That's been my TikTok following. That's been, Instagram Reels, YouTube Shorts now is doing really well. And so wherever I can reach people, that's where I'm going.
One last thing, because you do stand-up comedy too, so I wanted to make sure that you had the chance to tell everyone about that and how the coping through humor has really helped you too.
Yeah, so my recent venture, and actually this is a good talking point for what you just asked. My recent venture has been into stand-up comedy. And so I'm using it in the same way that I'm using motivational speaking and having these really serious conversations. I'm also doing that through comedy and just trying to help people be more open to talking about schizophrenia because it is a stigmatized illness, because it is hard for people to digest in a conversation. I found a lot of success in my TikTok by using trends and like funny videos to still educate people about schizophrenia. One of my most viral videos, and I get very upset about this because it took me like 5 seconds to film, and I've spent hours on videos that have gone nowhere. But I was sitting in my car and someone had asked, can I still drive with schizophrenia? And I opened it up, I responded to the comment, and I said, well, I can drive, but he can't. And I peered, and there was no one in my passenger seat. And that video did so well. And I was like, okay, and what I realized from that video was that people who had never followed me, who had never reached out, followed me, and they were sticking around to see my other content, my educational content, my content about what I go through, how I cope with symptoms. And so there's been people that have been not super happy with my adventure into comedy, but the way I explain it is, one, it's a coping mechanism for myself. I went through so much trauma with my incarceration, my addiction, and this is one of the ways I can share the story without it being too stressful, but it also helps reach an audience that I don't think otherwise would ever talk about schizophrenia or maybe even know what it is. And so it also just helps me be able to talk to more people. I always say that I'm super extroverted, so extroverted that I talk to people who aren't even there, and so it's been really cool to be able to use comedy to not only make other people laugh, but as a way to deal with what I've been through as well.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Kody. One last round of applause. Thank you all for being here.